Hello and welcome. We all care about privacy these days, and rightly so. And this means that your customers are more aware of the issues around privacy and data protection than ever. But what practical steps can you take to offer them more than just compliance? The answer is by adopting privacy by design. My name is Oisín Lunny. I am a senior contributor at Forbes and professor of UX-driven business at Barcelona Technology School. And I'm delighted to be joined for this special webinar today by a trio of telehealth, data protection and privacy experts to discuss why trust is the new oil and why that matters more than ever in the field of telehealth. So I'm delighted to welcome our trio of guest speakers who are Kim Frederick Schneider, the CEO of Abbey Global Health, Philippa Jayne Farley, BSc LLB, the consultant and auditor at Pro Privacy, and Emerald Liu, LLB, LLM, MSc, a privacy and data ethics specialist. She looks after privacy at Logitech. She's a Forbes female founder to watch, a TEDx speaker, and a very brilliant lecturer. Now, each of our guest speakers will first share their thoughts on the topic, and then we'll have an open discussion and invite questions from you, our very wonderful audience. Thank you all for joining us. So without any further ado, please welcome to the virtual stage the CEO and co-founder of Abbey Global Health, Kim Frederick Schneider.
Hi, everyone. Kim Schneider here, CEO and co-founder of Abbey Global Health. I am going to talk today a little bit about Abbey Global Health, our micro-consultation service, Abbey, and then I'd like to go into our philosophy as it relates to questions of data protection, privacy, and data ethics. So Abbey Global Health is a health technology business with operations in 14 countries around the world. My co-founder, Dr. Victor Vicens, and I, we started the business in order to close what we see as a critical gap in the first mile of healthcare between, on the one hand, Dr. Google, and on the other, real doctors. So Dr. Google, which we see as including all self-service digital health tools, so symptom checkers, health websites, these sorts of services, they're extraordinarily popular. They're also low cost, but there is very little evidence of an impact from these kinds of services. On the other hand, you have a lot happening at the moment in the digital health world in terms of synchronous consultations with doctors and making those more accessible and more digital. But of course, if a synchronous consultation happens by chat, phone, or video, the basic unit of interaction is still 10 to 15 minutes of a doctor's time. And therefore, it does little to reduce the impact on healthcare systems or the cost of that interaction. And because they're quite complicated to access, utilization rates are quite low. So we developed Abbey, which is a micro-consultation service to really bridge the gap between those two things. So on the one hand, Abbey uses quite sophisticated artificial intelligence and machine learning to make the process of a medical interaction highly efficient. But on the other hand, that interaction is always with a real doctor in order to, from the user's home country, in order to have a basis of trust there and really to drive adherence to the information provided. And quite radically, we have chosen to make the service available inside the world's most popular chat apps. So the Abbey micro-consultation service is available inside of WhatsApp, Telegram, Viber, even SMS. And of course, this unique approach raises a number of questions around privacy and security. And so I want to take a moment just to address some of our underlying philosophy, which has informed the way that we developed that service. So as we all know, the GDPR calls for data protection by design. We think that's very important, but we actually think that's not quite enough. And we're quite keen on taking it a step further and thinking about really data ethics by design. And when we talk about data and data protection, we very often think about the collection of data. But of course, when it comes to our service and a lot of other health services, it's actually a data exchange. We're both collecting data from users and we're providing users with data. And so we like to think about the ethics of data exchange and how that underlies our service. And we think particularly for our service and other health services, there are three key pillars there. One is that the service is accessible, that the service is secure, and that it's trustworthy. So I'd like to go through those 3 points one by one. So on the question of accessibility, I think we're all aware of what's known as the digital divide, the divide between the digital haves and have-nots. And this is of course a question of income, but also a question of geography, language, age. And our view is that if you think healthcare is a right, then and healthcare innovators need to consider the digital divide and consider access to these services when they're designing them. And this is why when we first started many years ago, it was so important for us to include, for example, SMS as a channel of communication. Because if you build a service that's an app, the best case scenario, you're reaching 2 or 3 billion people in the world. The moment you extend that service to SMS, you're adding another 3 billion people. There are an enormous number of people who actually may even have a smartphone, but don't use the internet connection on that phone, or don't regularly use the internet connection on that phone, either because they can't afford it or because there's no good coverage where they are. And the same is true with things like, high bandwidth interactions like video. So including SMS was a really important part of our early product design process. And then we also work with NGOs to extend access to our service to marginalized communities. We're launching shortly with, for example, a refugee camp in Greece to make our service available to those people. And of course, this relates to questions of language and culture too. So we ensure that people have access to doctors from their home country, that they're able to interact with the service in their own language as well. But of course, this question of accessibility, it's not just a question of whether the service is accessible, because almost any digital service, you could say, well, in theory, anybody could use it. But one of the big issues with telemedicine in particular is that it may be accessible, but it's not accessed. And so while the service in theory could be used, what you see actually is extraordinarily low utilization rates for most digital health services, particularly those that are app-based. And our approach, by integrating our service into these existing chat channels, into WhatsApp, SMS, Telegram, et cetera, we see utilization rates that are 10 to 20 times higher than what you see from traditional telemedicine apps. And we think that that is not just a good design choice, but we actually think it's a good ethical choice as well, to make the service accessible and accessed, meeting people where they actually are. And in terms of meeting people where they are, this also relates to questions of security, which is the second pillar. So, people are already using chat apps to interact in all kinds of ways, including with physicians. So actually the inspiration for our service was to look at existing user behavior and then try to build a service around that behavior. So those of us who are lucky enough to have family members or friends who are doctors, this is the way we're interacting with them. When we have a quick medical question, we send them a WhatsApp and we get an answer. That's quite a normal way for people to behave. So our question was, okay, so how can we mimic that kind of an interaction? Advantages to these kinds of technologies. Most chat apps already end encryption. With chat, users actually have quite a high degree of control over their own conversation. They can delete their side of a conversation very, very easily. And there's a lot of transparency about what that interaction looks like. But the question we have is not just about how to keep it secure, about how it's already secure, but how we can keep it secured. And so that's a question then of what additional steps can you take, right? So for example, we don't track our users, we don't drop cookies, and we really make sure that we're collecting the minimum amount of data that's necessary to deliver the service. We are not a data business. We are a service business, and I think that's it's really important, even from the standpoint of what is your fundamental business model. That also has an implication on data ethics. And then because this is a mediated interaction, the user and the doctor are actually never directly in touch with each other. So, and to the physician, the user actually maintains their privacy because we don't share the name, we don't share context, we only share the age and the gender of the user, which is all they really need in order to provide some basic indicative information, which is consultation is all about. Again, we're not providing diagnosis, we're not providing treatment, we're not providing prescriptions. So a lot of these deeper data points are simply not necessary, and so we don't even go there. This approach, this mediated approach to an interaction, what we call a live Q&A, it allows the user to have an experience of a live chat with the doctor, but actually there's greater security and privacy for that individual. But that the fact that there is a real doctor on the other end and that the doctor is identified to the user, that's really key to the next and last principle, which is trustworthiness. So I don't think it's news to anyone that we are experiencing a crisis of trust globally. Levels of trust in media, politicians, experts are at an all-time low. At the same time, everybody with a Twitter account pretends that they're an expert on every topic under the sun. But we have felt from the beginning of our service that it is, again, an ethical imperative to prioritize expertise. And that expertise matters particularly when it comes to healthcare. And that was one of our basic principles. Service was to give people and to professional medical advice, which generally is kept hidden and protected from people. I think recently this question of the importance of expertise has really been highlighted by the current pandemic. And we found that the leaders who rely on expertise, who rely on the professionals who have dedicated their lives to a particular subject, those are the leaders who have been more successful in the current pandemic. And I think it's, in some respects, pretended that expertise doesn't matter. So what does that mean for our service? It means that we work with an invitation-only network of real doctors. So those physicians, obviously, they're licensed to practice. They have the expertise that comes with a medical education and with the regular practice of medicine in a clinic or a hospital. But they're also then vetted and trained on our system. And we have specific clinical guidelines for their work. Because the interactions are chat-based, that actually gives us an unprecedented to ensure quality. So our in-house medical team is able to have a much better view of those interactions than, let's say, in a hospital or a clinic, where, best case, you're auditing maybe 1% of cases, and you're doing that. Interaction can be audited. But it's not just a question of whether information is trustworthy. Again, there are plenty of websites or symptom checkers or other sort of Dr. Google services that could say, it's not just a question of whether it's trustworthy. It's a question of whether it's trusted. People actually believe and accept the information that's provided, and they adhere to the information that's there and actually change their behavior as a result. Things that we think are really critical. One is that our users are rated by, our physicians are rated by the users and are prioritized by our machine learning algorithms. So our AI analyzes the question, matches it with the right doctor, and prioritizes based on what it says, but how they say it. That matters in terms of being trusted, in terms of the information being trusted. And of course, the answers are personalized and they're coming from a named doctor, which then increases the trust as well. So we've asked our doctors to give us an estimate out of 10 cases, on average, how many times do they think they're saving people a visit to an in-person visit to the doctor. And on average, our doctors think they're doing that in 7 out of 10 cases. We run in an ongoing basis a similar assessment with our users themselves. So we ask them, have we helped you save a visit to the doctor? And what's so interesting is that, again, more than 70% of cases indicate that we have helped them save a visit to the doctor. So that synchronicity between what the physician's perspective of the service and the user's perspective, we think speaks to a high level of trust in real doctors, and that frankly people just aren't ready for robot doctors to replace real ones, whatever the quality of that particular technology. So what's quite interesting here is, although with a micro consultation it only takes about a minute of a doctor's time, it's an intentionally limited interaction. It's a mediated interaction mediated by AI. We still see an enormous level of trust and a very high adherence to the information provided, which we think is quite extraordinary for this sort of service. So on the subject of experts, I of course am an expert on our service, on our business, but I am not at all an expert when it comes to questions of data protection. So time to hand over to the real experts, to Philippa and to Emerald, and that's enough from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kim Frederick. That was absolutely brilliant. I agree with you totally about the role of experts and the importance of experts. A politician who shall not be named on this webinar said something along the lines of, we've had enough of experts, when confronted with some expert advice, and I strongly disagree with that sentiment. Speaking of which, as you say, we have two fantastic experts coming up for the remainder of the webinar, and our first expert is Philippa Jayne Farley, who is a BSc in Artificial Intelligence and an LLP in IP and IT law. She's a consultant and auditor for cybersecurity, GDPR, data protection and privacy at Pro Privacy, and we're very grateful and lucky to have her join us today. So ladies and gents, please welcome to our virtual stage Philippa Jayne Farley.
Hi, Oisin and Kim, thanks so much for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be here, especially discussing access to essential services whilst protecting fundamental rights. So as I see it, our context for this discussion is facilitating access to the expertise of the medical professional through the use of technology within a controlled environment, and the associated required trust of the individual when making use of such technology in order to access that expertise. It's my opinion that we can engender and nurture trust through our adherence to the principles of data protection. I'm going to say it's not quite as per a famous past president, also US president, who said trust but verify. These days we prefer, I think, to verify and then to trust. So on that point, I would say, you know, like when we speak about ethics, data ethics or data-related ethics, we're waiting on frameworks to be developed and that discussion to mature. We look to the data protection frameworks and action within the data protection sphere to nurture or bolster the trust of the individual in services, specifically services related to technology. Okay, so we're looking to underpin the ethics with action in the data protection space, and specifically looking at data protection by design. So I think a lot of people on this webinar would understand data protection by design, precursor privacy by design. You know, we've kind of gone on from there a bit, and we would say here that data protection by design is basically the exercise of embedding the principles as embodied in the GDPR. It's not a simple process, and it involves technical measures, physical controls, and policy and procedural controls. So when we're looking at a service like ABI, a telehealth service, where we have various different aspects or different systems, you know, interconnected, various stages of having to protect data and control data, and putting the access to the service, the choice of the access to the service in the hands of the user, it can turn into quite a complex assessment, or a complex, how can I say, management kind of process, understanding all the different actors involved. So if we look at the principles broadly and then bring it down into this context, it might help us understand how we are approaching the data protection by design, and you know, how I personally think that these kinds of technologies should be approaching data protection by design. If we look at lawfulness, fairness, and transparency, we have to bear in mind under lawfulness that there's a crossover and a complexity of regulatory requirements. It's not just technology, it's not just GDPR. We're dealing with a medical regulatory requirements here too. So we have to bear in mind the lawfulness under the data protection requirements, the lawfulness under the medical requirements. And very specifically, when we're looking at the different data processing activities within these systems, we have to identify our legal basis for processing. That's just a technical point. Record keeping is a very important part of data protection by design. So for these types of systems, you would be looking at, if you're looking for a partner, if you're looking to implement a system like this, are your Article 30 records of processing in order? Fairness, so lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. For fairness, the individual is central, so the end user is central, and as Kim has mentioned several times there, very much a consideration here is the access to the service, the access to medical knowledge, medical help, medical assistance. So we're looking at an individual that needs help, and we must not process their data in a way that's detrimental, unexpected, misleading, or deceptive. So when we're looking at solutions now in the telehealth space or health-related technology processing, I just an aside, especially with the COVID-19 related applications, we look at this notion of the processing not being detrimental, unexpected, misleading, or deceptive. So if you're using an application, an app, to process your health data, is your data being processed in a way that you would expect? So we don't want to go outside of the scope of what we've identified the processing should be. Okay, and yeah, as I said, the individual should be central. We go back to the point that Kim made, and we look at the digital divide as being a serious issue in many countries right now. So we look at the use of appropriate technology and applications with the individual in mind. And that goes to the point of Abby's choices as to how the user can access the service. And I'll speak a little bit more on that later on from the point of the user education perspective. For me, transparency is key to building trust. So you need to know your audience. Audiences that might access such services would be vulnerable groups such as teens and migrants. We're looking for clear and plain language. We don't want to hide behind high-end terminology. We don't want to use any language that manipulates the individual or the end user of these applications. The transparency documentation, the data protection notice is not a once-off, it's an ongoing obligation. So as the service changes, as the technologies might be reviewed, you want to review your notice and you want to update it as you go along. Very much central again to this principle, and designing your documentation is actually standing in the shoes of the user and going, would somebody understand this? And you know, at some point you might be doing it in pictures and video format for some data subject groups. Purpose limitation is the next principle that we'll look at, and this is really important with health related processing, that you are absolutely specific and absolutely explicit about your purpose. What are you achieving with this processing? What is the point of it? Further processing is a huge issue in the space at the moment, where data is taken, where it was intended for one purpose in the application, it's taken and used in many other ways. And I'll note specifically here, if you're processing data and you have a nice big data store and somebody is after it and you think, okay, sure, yeah, I'll just anonymize this data store and then it's anonymous data, it's not personal data. It doesn't work like that. Generally, there are regulations which state that you must get consent to anonymize the data before you pass the data on. But first and foremost, you should have defined your purpose. If you were intending to use the data for research purposes, statistics, whatever, you should have defined your purpose widely enough at the outset that the data subject understood what they were getting themselves into when they started using the application. So when you're looking for a partner in this space, or you're looking for a service provider, you really want to find somebody who has gone through these steps and can work with you on defining the purpose and understanding what you're going to do with the service and the application. Data minimization, this is one thing I really love about Abby, and Kim has mentioned it, I think when he spoke, is that the absolute minimum amount of data is collected in order to provide the end user with service. So data minimization is really important when we look at security considerations, because if we're looking at worst case scenarios, data breaches, we want to know that the least amount of data possible could have been breached. We want to know exactly what that is. And obviously we don't want the end user to come to any harm. So within data minimization, your security controls, there's also an aspect of, separation of data and obviously various other methodologies you can put in place to secure that data. So at the outset, we want to collect the minimum amount of data, and making use of Abby, you'll note that it does do that. This is a huge part of data protection by design, where you can build data minimization into the application as you go along. Accuracy is the next principle. Putting the ability to keep data up to date and accurate into the user's hands is an easy to implement part of data protection by design. So yeah, there's obviously further consideration that you might require an audit trail of changes, especially in the medical health context. These are the kinds of questions you should be asking about telehealth applications. How do you manage those changes to the medical record, if any? And how much control does the user have? Furthermore, if you allow the user to kind of manage their record of data, it does instill confidence in them and builds up that trust in the user. Storage limitation is another principle. So very specifically, we would say that partners or the people along the data processing chain need to collaborate in this regard. Regulatory requirements would be the primary driver when it comes to determining storage requirements. How long are you going to keep the records for? What needs to be kept, and you should go from there. So usually you cannot just keep data indefinitely. You can't say I might need it one day. You need to know, obviously previously we've said exactly what you're going to use it for, and that should drive your decisions on how long you're going to keep the data for. Recommended here again, and this is part of your data protection by design and the framework that you have over it, strong policy documentation and record keeping of deletions, data destruction. And again, like the need to collaborate between parties is very important here. Helps you respond to data access requests and, ensure the rights of data subjects are protected. Integrity and confidentiality is the next point. So we're looking at, again, a crossover of regulatory requirements. Obviously, in the medical fields, health data, there's huge requirements on you, very important requirements on you to make sure that confidentiality is maintained and there is the assurance of data integrity. So again, we're looking at security requirements. If you're looking for a partner in the space, you're going to be asking questions on security audits, penetration testing, that kind of thing. So appropriate levels of security are necessary. And within that, we don't only look at the tech measures that are taken, but we look at physical security as well as organizational measures, related to access to data and policy in that regard. I would include here under integrity and confidentiality user education, and it's something that's not brought up often enough, I think, where I think that we need to respect the fact that people have a choice in their use of technology. If they choose to access services a certain way, there's that onus on us to make sure that there's that element of user education and the choice. So where Abby would allow you access to the service via various different chat applications, the choice of using text messaging is there, as well as the native application online. So we're respecting the choice of the user, and we're providing some user education in, kind of how to manage the data on your end. So there's an element of understanding the application that you're using, understanding the controls over that application, making sure your own settings are correct, making sure you understand and know how to manage your chat logs, access to your devices, etc. Okay, so yeah, I'd be saying there that you kind of become a trusted partner to the individual, helping them manage and mind their own data. And last of all, accountability. You should be able to demonstrate compliance with the principles of data protection. So can you tick all the boxes in your data protection by design exercise? So substantively tick all the boxes. Can you actually say that this is built into the application, the procedures, the processes? And key elements here for accountability would be, appointing a DPO if you're required to appoint a DPO, and doing DPIAs, data protection impact assessments. your data protection impact assessment should be, again, a living process that gets updated, reviewed as technology moves on, as risks change, as your user profile changes, your stakeholder engagement needs to be reviewed. That DPIA is kind of key to the accountability. And in some ways, when we're working with tech solutions, the DPIA is the linchpin to the data protection by design process. It informs several different parts of it. So yeah, when we're looking at DPIAs, collaboration between partners is really important. The data controller should drive the process of getting the DPIA done, where the processor should inform the data controller of, technically what's going on, helping them with risk mitigation, so on and so forth. So yeah, I will highlight again the absolute need for stakeholder engagement when you're doing your data protection impact assessments, particularly where vulnerable groups are involved. It's really important to get the perspectives of the users, the end users, the data subjects, people, like if you're talking about migrant reception centers, you've got people involved in that kind of work that can really shed a huge perspective on what you're doing. So, if you're looking for a telehealth partner or provider to understand your focus groups and to do the DPIAs with them in mind. Okay, so last of all, I'll say, I think the biggest thing for me here is to make sure that you find a partner that can help you if you're looking to provide sort of a telehealth stream in your services. Look for a partner that can help you assert that accountability and assist with engendering trust. It can be quite an ethereal thing to discuss about ethics and trust and what can we actually do to nurture that trust and build it and make sure that it stays there. So yeah, through our processes and through our procedures, through our accountability measures, we can do that in a very real way. I think that the focus should be on a robust framework, managing roles and responsibilities between parties. So we're looking for a really robust data processing agreement that clearly outlines those roles and responsibilities and the collaboration on the DPIA, where the controller drives the process and really gets to grips with what is being provided through the technology. And yeah, thanks, Oisin. I think that's it from me for now.
Wonderful. Wow, that was so interesting, Philippa. Thank you. That was a real deep dive. I mean, I'm glad this webinar has been recorded because there's so many, it's like a gold mine of useful information for anybody who wants to up their data protection game. One of your points made me think of the great Vanilla Ice, or indeed Jedward, who said famously, it's time to stop, collaborate and listen. So maybe it's time for the telehealth industry to stop, collaborate and listen to what the customers actually want. So we're going to go from the ridiculous back to the sublime. Another of our fantastic experts coming up, Emerald Stiliou, LLP, LLM, MSc, who is a data ethics and privacy specialist. She looks after privacy at Logitech. She's a Forbes female founder to watch. She's a TEDx speaker and a very brilliant lecturer. I've seen her speak a bunch of times and she's fantastic. I'm so happy you could join us, Emerald. Thank you so much. The stage is yours, Emerald Stiliou.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. It's so in the list of attendees today. So after those two brilliant presentations, what can I say? I'm not going to do a deep dive with you. In fact, my goal today is very much more to take a bird's eye view and to provide some thoughts that I hope will make you think a little bit more about the legal framework you actually operate in, the what I call consent double whammy in health, data ethics, and how to design technology that is more aligned with what we need as human beings. Now, just to start off, ethics in telemedicine, it's not a new topic. The conversation actually started way in the 1980s, around the same time of this rapid technological growth. For example, in 2006, the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities was officially assigned by the WHO to investigate the ethical issues in telemedicine. Now, obviously, as years went on, this topic became more and more important, and now especially so during a global pandemic where a lot of people, according to the reporting, are less inclined to actually go to a GP's office, which is deeply concerning. And obviously we need to find solutions for that. Now, when technology advances more rapidly, we as human beings actually run into many challenges. And we see this very much so with now COVID and the tracking apps and the various conversations that are happening around that. You know, we need to think about, is an app actually helpful? And is the trade-off worth it? You know, what are the consequences, short-term and long-term, if we trade off privacy in place of public health? Now, there is already so much wrong with the fact that that particular question is being asked. You know, it's a false dichotomy. We can have public health, private care through the likes of telemedicine, and privacy and solid ethical practices all at the same time. Now, before we go into specific laws such as the GDPR, I always think it's really important to get the fundamentals right, both when it comes to healthcare and when it comes to protecting personal data. And I often find that this is missing in people who in particular discuss the GDPR. I often find that their foundation of what happened before that is missing. And I think for good decision making, it's really important to understand where legislation actually comes from. So we often hear privacy and data protection used interchangeably, but they really aren't the same thing. You know, the right to privacy is not just the right of an individual, it's also a social value. It's universal, whereas the right to data protection isn't quite there yet. You'll actually find these rights codified in different articles. Now, if you look at the Charter for Fundamental Rights, you'll find the right to a private life in Article 7, where, as well as in Article 8 of the Convention on Human Rights, where you find the right to data protection in Article 8. And if you actually open up the Charter of Fundamental Rights, and I always think it's a really good idea to actually read the law. A lot of people are intimidated by it, but it's actually not that difficult. I know we have a couple of lawyers in the meeting with us today, so don't be offended. Not everybody is a lawyer, so just to bring them up to speed as well. If you read Article 8, which covers this right to data protection, you'll see a lot of the GDPR concepts in there. And I personally believe that it's really important to look at the body of law in a holistic way to understand where legislation comes from and what the intent is of the legislation. It really helps in making better decisions on a day-to-day basis. You don't have to be an expert on every article of the law. If you understand its intent, you will naturally already make better decisions. Now, as I alluded to earlier, the digital revolution provided with many benefits for health, the environment, etc., etc. But technology should not dictate our values and our rights. And neither should the relationship be reduced to that false dichotomy I referred to earlier. We can have all of our rights at the same time. And we do this through accountability, good design, and adherence to the law. And we don't really have time to discuss all of the ethical and privacy concerns in telemedicine today because I want to leave enough room for the Q&A section. So I'm going to focus on two big concerns, one being confidentiality of the data and the ethics and the legal requirements around consent. Now, I'm going to share one of my favorite quotes with you. It's from Tristan Harris. He used to take care of ethics at Google. And he said, "Most recent conversations about the future focus on the point where technology surpasses human capability, but they overlook a much earlier point, which is where technology exceeds human vulnerabilities." And I find this really interesting, and I would argue that we have been there for a while. You know, tech has moved so quickly, and our lizard brains, that part of our brain that just is impulsive and that we don't really have conscious control over, it struggles to keep up with that. And you see this a lot in social media where the manipulation of that has just been taken to the max. Now, privacy engineering and ethical design is, because of this, becoming more and more popular as technology just keeps accelerating. When it comes to healthcare, it becomes even more important that the technology, as well as the design of the service delivery, is aligned with our innate human vulnerabilities. For example, when it comes down to how you get consent and the way you inform a patient, and as Philippa said earlier, this transparency is so important. It's really crucial that the person actually understands what they're consenting to. What are they opting into? And this starts at the point of them signing up for a service, assuming that this is not done through a GP's office, but rather through an online telemedicine provider. I mean, you know, it's one thing to click, I agree to the terms and conditions and privacy policy on a social media platform, so you can be effectively marketed to, but it's quite something else when it comes to healthcare data, the treatments you may or may not be receiving, and of course, where this very sensitive data goes once you have consented. Now, you know, if we look at consent just from the medical setting, some of the things you should be including would be, you know, a description of the medical procedures, the positive results expected from a treatment, description of the potential risks, any alternative treatments you could choose. But then we haven't quite combined that type of consent with the consent and transparency requirements required under data protection law. And I'm just going to speak about this particularly with the GDPR lens on, because I think most of us are probably in Europe. So if we look at consent under the GDPR and we look at Article 6, which is just consent for regular personal data, then it makes it really clear that this consent needs to be freely given, specific, informed, unambiguous, and should be a clear indication by a statement or a clear affirmative action that a person agrees to having their data processed in a certain way. Now, that's all well and good, but when it comes to data that pertains to health, you also need to look at Article 9, which speaks of explicit consent, which implies a higher bar. Now, nobody really knows what that higher bar is yet, but I think it makes it really clear to us that the individual should be fully aware, not just of the treatments, but also of the exact data processing involved. Where does the data go? Who has access to it? How long is it retained? Will it be anonymized or will it simply be pseudonymized? And of course, what are their rights as regards their personal data? Now, this is where design comes in, right? Because this is not the time to throw it all into a big, long privacy policy and ask them in a screen that simply links to said policy and say, do you consent to this? Now, you absolutely need a privacy policy, but you should also think about other ways in which you can, you know, communicate this information. Could you have a web page on privacy on your site that describes in a video or with graphics in layman's terms what actually happens to the data? Can you come up with another creative way in which you can display something as complex as a privacy policy? Because the really hard thing about privacy policies and also meeting this transparency requirement, particularly when the processing of the data is of a rather complex nature, is how do you make sure you meet all of the requirements of the policy itself while keeping it easy to read and making it understandable? Now, I like this idea of having this additional layer of transparency through just having a basic privacy page where you kind of in a friendly language explain what is happening. Now, that's absolutely not a legal requirement unless your privacy policy is really difficult to read, but then from a GDPR perspective, you're already kind of in trouble, right? So now, the key thing is that the presence of the informed consent not only supports the patient's ethical rights, but also removes any consent or any concern around the confidentiality of the data. And the reason that I've been hammering on now about, you know, how you get this consent, particularly online or in any kind of technological environment, that is really important, is because what we're seeing is a lot of what we call dark patterns in technological design. We see this especially a lot with the cookies, you know, the annoying cookie banners we still get. A common example of that would be, let's say you visit a website and you get a cookie banner. What often happens is they'll make you switch each tracker on or off individually, well, off in most cases, instead of being able to deny all of them in one go. Now, this is obviously not lawful, but it's a good example of a dark pattern. It's creating that friction to make it difficult for you to not be tracked. So a dark pattern essentially is just a sneaky way of having people opt into more comprehensive data processing or surveillance through the design. Now, consent has to be valid, right? So you're putting yourself on the hook for GDPR enforcement at worst and damage to your brand at best, if that's poorly done. Now, technology for technology's sake, I believe, is never really a good idea. But, you know, more importantly, when designing digital products and services, it's really important that this digital service actually gives us a better experience than we had before. And, you know, that the technology actually serves us as humans and not vice versa. This means that when we create new products and design these new services, that we need to think not only about security, privacy, and data protection, but also about other, you know, these innate human vulnerabilities that I mentioned earlier. Just to name a few, we need to think about our limited attention span. You know, it's often not clear what we are opting into. The effect our technology can have on a user's mental health. I think this is especially important in a medical setting, which already, if there's something wrong with you, that already causes a lot of strain. Are you causing even more strain if you are moving something online? And also, how will it affect human relationships? You know, in telemedicine in particular, the doctor-patient relationship is crucial. And I think a lot of people think about this. If you go to telemedicine, will I have the same bond with the person providing me with the service as I would have if I went to an actual person? Now, it's not to say it can't be done. It's just to say that that is something that needs to be considered. Now, I could go on about humane technology all day, so I will leave it at that. I hope it gave you some food for thought, and I think we have some time left for the Q&A, so thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Emerald. It was fascinating. As always, you managed to explain very complex issues, things I really don't understand, in a way that just makes sense. So thanks as always. Brilliant. So we've really had, you know, a deep dive. We've had the helicopter view. We've had some, you know, real world examples of a service, Abby, who are actually pioneering this approach to data protection and telehealth. So we do have a window for questions, and we're inviting you, our wonderful audience, to ask questions there. You're very welcome to ask questions. Our speakers can see the questions and can have a think about whether they are able to provide answers now. They look like quite complex. Oh, we have and the comments as well. Nice comments like we've just seen there. Philippa, your explanation to approach data protection design is very enlightening. So yes, we like nice comments for our speakers as well. Thank you. While our speakers have a moment to look at those questions and decide if they're going to go into more detail there, I have a few questions to start with. Things I found really, really interesting about what you were all saying. I mean, Emerald, you touched on this, but I'd like to come to you, your good self, Kim, about this concept of health debt. And, you know, if services are, you know, not user friendly and they're not meeting people in the real world, you know, what happens? There was a New York Times article. I think that the subject of it was, where have all the heart attacks gone? What do you think is happening to people's willingness to perhaps engage with technology and even engage with, you know, with hospitals in the context of, you know, services being easy to use or too difficult to use, or hospitals being, you know, obviously under a lot of strain with COVID-19? How do you think the technology can help people actually access the healthcare and the telehealth services they need to in the best possible way?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think it's a good way of putting it. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we believe very strongly in meeting people where they are, and recognizing their humanity, including their, you know, their misunderstandings, their foibles, the fact that they might not always make the best choices. And you know, there are really two sides to this same coin, which is the problem of the first mile of healthcare. On the one hand, the inefficiencies in the first mile means that a lot of people are going to see the doctor when they shouldn't, which is of course very expensive. It wastes their time, it wastes the doctor's time. But there's actually a much bigger problem, which is being exacerbated by the current pandemic, which is people not going to the doctor when they should. And that's actually both much more expensive and it costs lives. I mean, the difference, even if you look at something like bowel cancer, which is the second largest, second leading cancer cause of cancer death after lung cancer.
Wow.
You know, the difference between early diagnosis survival at 95% and late diagnosis survival, I believe it's something like 12%. It's quite significant.
Yeah.
So you know, you have to balance these questions of, that's why we see it as a larger ethical question, right? Of course, it's about data protection, privacy, security, but also, you know, of course, no system of security is perfect. And, you know, are we going to say that nobody's allowed to drive a car because people can? No, we have to find a way to have good road rules, well-designed streets, well-designed signs, good regulations about cars. But you know, these are, in the same way, we need to find, absolutely, it is an ethical imperative to ways to give people easier access to professional medical care. There's no question that that's a problem. It's costing lives. So the question is, how do we do so in a way that, again, respects people's privacy, that complies with data protection regulations, and not just regulations, but again, principles and data protection ethics as well. So for us, this is not, these are not easy answers. And I think what I really appreciate about what Emerald and Pips have discussed as well is, and by the way, we're not perfect, right? We have a lot more to do. But I think what they're doing is they're raising a lot of important questions, which I think need to be taken into account when you provide these kinds of services. I don't think a lot of these things are black and white. It's a question of how can we do better, how can we improve, and how can we, again, make sure that we're not erring on the side of making services impenetrable or too difficult to use, or preventing people from getting the help that they need for the sake of some concept which isn't a priority for them. I think that's, again, balancing people's priorities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you kind of nailed the most important consideration here. If people, for whatever reasons, are not getting access to the healthcare they need, they could die. That's how it's a life and death decision. Making this stuff user friendly, meeting people where they are, is there's nothing more important. But Philippa, I really liked your comment on data minimization even, and I liked what you were saying, because, you know, my impression of, you know, we've heard this this phrase, data is the new oil, for, you know, years and years and years, and everyone thinks, you know, any company that does anything with data, they're just hoovering it all up into a big data farm and they're rinsing it and selling it to advertisers. But, you know, you've mentioned that Abby is actually doing the opposite of this. It's using the least amount. Talk to us, you know, are enough companies doing this? Should more companies be doing this? Because it's very refreshing to hear this approach.
Yeah, well, don't try and say pseudonymization. You know, you need a bit of practice for that one. Minimization is okay enough. Yeah, the words in this legislation just crack me up. Yeah, with minimization, I mean, it requires an intense study at the start, and this is part of the data protection by design, of exactly what you're going to need. So you need to actually go from step A to Z and understand everything you're going to be doing and go, okay, exactly what data are we going to need to achieve this purpose, and then take only that data. Okay, so if your purpose, your intention is to sell the data on, you know, et cetera, and you're going to do that, you collect what you need for that purpose. But in terms of providing a telehealth service, what do you actually need from that user to make use of the service? You know, simply a name, some kind of contact to be in touch with that person, or to facilitate that connection between applications. That's simply it. The user tells the doctor themselves what they need after that, you know? So yeah, it is that simple.
Yeah, indeed. And you just kind of reminded me of that. So forgive me if I have any of the details wrong. I'm going to say it anyway, but I think it was one of the big genetic profiling services. It may have been 23andMe. I'm not entirely sure, but one of the big ones announced that they were doing a deal with some kind of insurance company. And
it was them. I'm sure it was them. Yeah.
And at that point, me being slightly conspiratorial, I kind of went, "Aha! I knew it was for that." Or, you know, yes, So it kind of shows you how how fragile trust is. And, you know, I don't know if I'd be inclined to trust another similar company unless they were explicitly saying, this isn't our business model. We are not just going to sell all your data, but this minimization actually just takes that option off the table altogether, which is fantastic.
Precisely. And alongside that, in parallel, is the free versus paid services argument. You know, if you're not paying, you're the product. We're hearing that more and more now. So if you look at a service like Abby, it's generally provided through a partner or a user pay. There are obviously some considerations Kim's made during the COVID crisis, but generally it's a paid for service. So there's revenue being generated through the use of the service, and the data has to go nowhere else. You know, that is a key consideration alongside the minimization, you know, and that helps to build the trust because, you know, there is that relationship that's clearly outlined.
Yes. Yeah. Very, very good. And Emerald, I really liked your presentation. I thought it was so full of empathy for the end user and, you know, kind of understanding that people are not necessarily going to sit down and read a 50-page T's and C's or understand the intricacies of the data agreement with a particular company. Do you think there's anything in particular that the insurance industry or the telehealth industry can adopt around, you know, best practice for transparency and, you know, implementing this concept of humane technology, which I absolutely love?
Okay, yeah, I do think that there's many things you can do, right? The first thing you need to do always is, if I find out what is actually being done with my data, will it be a surprise? If the answer is yes, you should probably not be doing it, which kind of goes back into that data minimization thing, right? And of course, how you display the information to the person, because, you know, to deliver certain services, sometimes you do need some more data about somebody. Like I'm very much about absolutely innovate, because you can have both innovation as well as ethics, as well as privacy. I said it a couple of times, I think. Now, the next thing to do is to educate yourself. You know, what is humane technology? Can I do some sort of data ethics impact assessment? Am I being inclusive? Will it be discriminatory in any way? Am I considering, for example, the person's attention span? Are there additional things I can do on top of the essentials? And I think, like the example that I gave, would have a page on privacy or have a page on your core values and beliefs, and then do exactly that. Because the moment you make a mistake there, the trust is gone. And that brings us 360. We're back at the title of this webinar. But I do think education. I'm not sure if you've heard of humane technology. It's humanetech.com. I don't think it's a .com, but if you Google humane tech and Tristan Harris, I would encourage you to watch his TED talk about it. He has a long presentation on YouTube. I think it's like 45 minutes long. And he basically just lays it out, all the ways in which technology can impact us. And it goes beyond privacy and security. You know, they're very important.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
not the only thing.
I've seen one of Tristan Harris's talk, and I'm a big fan. I absolutely love his approach. Some brilliant insights there. We are sort of coming up to the end of the hour, incredibly. Do we have any more comments or answers for the questions? Kim?
I just wanted to make one point, which is we have more questions than we can get to, and I just wanted to reassure people that we will review the questions afterwards, and we'll get back to you individually on your questions. Some of them are way too complicated to get into in the short amount of time we have here, so we'll answer you individually. Your questions have been seen, and we'll.
Fabulous. That's perhaps the best answer we could have at this moment for the questions. Philippa, did you have a comment there? Was it
just quickly, generally, and the questions, there's a couple that this might slightly not in great detail, and that's to do with the partners along the chain of the data processing activities. So in terms of the chat providers, this is what I was talking about, a roadwork encapsulated in data processing agreement. So there is that regulation over the relationship in terms of law. There's that regulation over the relationship in terms of the contract provisions. So you do have protection under that.
Okay, Fabulous, fabulous. I think we've opened a very interesting and valuable can of worms there. I, for one, stand immensely educated by today's webinar. So I'm afraid that is all the time we have for this brilliant discussion. I just wanted to say thank you so much, Kim, Frederick, Philippa, and Emerald, for joining us today to talk about why trust is the new oil and why that matters more than ever for telehealth. So, I mean, some key takeaways for me. Oops, my goodness, sorry, I'm just seeing something in the background there. My PowerPoint is gone rogue. In summary, giving your customers the best possible experience of telehealth involves things like moving from data protection by design through to data ethics by design, and indeed data exchange by design, and this new form of transparency. You know, your service needs to be not just accessible, but accessed, not just secure, but secured, and not just trustworthy, but trusted. So what do you think? So reach out to our guest speakers or myself with any further comments or questions. I'm just going to put everyone's contact details on the screen right now. When I click this button, oops, excuse me, when I click this other button. And yeah, please continue the conversation online. Find us on social media, reach out on LinkedIn, and any questions that have been asked will be answered directly. So tomorrow, I believe you're going to be sent a replay of the webinar, and you will all be notified when we run a follow-up webinar, which is all about the ROI of telehealth. Please feel free to share the invite with your friends and family, and do reach out to all of us on social media or drop us an email. Thank you all so much for joining. Thank you once again to our brilliant expert speakers. It's such a pleasure to hear that expertise. And thank you all. Have a great evening.
Thank you so much, Jayne. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.